A very good day to you and welcome to the Election Watch program, proudly brought to you by Civio Institute. Election Watch is all about having conversations around the elections with young people, women, youth, the church, and so much more. Today we're going to be talking about the importance of peace and disagreeing peacefully. Sometimes a lot of people do agree that disagreeing should lead to some sort of conflict or violence, but it's okay to sometimes disagree peacefully. And to join me for this conversation, I have with me Bishop Neva Mparuza, who is the president of the Evangelical Fellowship of Zimbabwe and presiding bishop of Pentecostal Assemblies of Zimbabwe. Bishop Mparuza is the current president of EFZ, which has over 800 member organizations covering millions of Christians in Zimbabwe. And we also have on this panel Jana Ncube, who's the Deputy Chief Executive Officer at Crisis Action. And Jana is a renowned policy advisor, governance specialist, and feminist who has worked for leading African institutions, including SADC. And, it's quite interesting that elections are established, or are the established mechanism for the peaceful arbitration of political rivalry and transfers of power. And in practice, however, many elections actually prove deeply destabilizing, leading to violence and conflict. And it's interesting that in Zimbabwe's harmonized election, which is scheduled for August the 23rd, 2023, and the previous elections, they have sort of been plagued with violence and conflict. And today we're here to discuss with the experts how we can actually have peaceful elections going forward. Welcome. How are you today?
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. And I'll start with Jana. Jana, why is it important for these elections to be peaceful? And how does it ensure that elections are actually seen as credible? What is the link between peace and credible elections?
Well, the concept of credible elections is really about allowing citizens to express their will freely, to be able to choose the people that will lead them going forward without coercion, without manipulation, without interfering with their ability to make a choice and make a decision for themselves that this is who I want, and certainly without violence. And an ability to create an election that adheres to these concepts and principles will make it easier for citizens to accept whatever results come out of that. But if the process is marred and the process is questionable, that's actually where we then have discontentment, a refusal to accept the outcome, and that's what can eventually disturb peace at the end of the day. I mean, I am quite confident, all of us know, I always say for us in Zimbabwe, in SADC, in Africa, we are post-liberation movement countries. Our countries, we got the independence to roll ourselves as Black people through an expression of violence, the war. So the memories, even for people like me who were not part of that, but we lived them through our families, our parents, the memories of war still hang on us. So we really value and understand the value of peace in our society, because it's what enables us to live, to take care of ourselves, of our families, of our nation, and to develop.
Thank you very much, Jana. And obviously, it's very important that we continue having conversations around peace as it leads to the development of a country as well. Bishop, Zimbabwe has a history of violence. And just as Jana Ncube obviously reiterated that we managed to get independence through some sort of violence, and these are memories that are constantly recurring. Have we learned enough lessons? I mean, looking at the laws, are they adequate enough to ensure that history doesn't repeat itself?
Yes. What can I say? I think the laws are enough. What's not at place is a willing mind and heart. That's what's lacking. The willingness of our people, and particularly those in leadership, to just make sure that those laws that are there are adhered to or are applied fairly to every citizen so that there is no violence. The issue is if one particular individual feels are not fairly treated, then sometimes it puts people in a place where they take the law unto themselves, into their own hands. So I think we have learned. We have learned from the very beginning when we lost our relatives, when we lost those who went to war. You can't tell me I've not learned enough when I lost my brothers, when I lost my aunties. What I went through during the war, I was there myself as a young person, as a Mujiba, we have learned enough violence from the people, the consequence of violence from the people we've lost. We have learned enough from the processes of how we've done our elections as well. And it's needless to lose anyone because of elections.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
A bishop is right to say the lessons are there. I just think what is maybe really frustrating and disturbing is that the lessons are not being embraced. And the embracing, perhaps, as Bishop points out, might be in the laws and the policies. So when you read the text of the Constitution and the electoral laws, it's as if the lessons have been inculcated in there. But the embracing, which ought to be in how those who are responsible authorities in all these processes, I think we can all agree it's not yet there anymore. No one, as Bishop says, should ever lose their life because of an election.
Yes.
It's an indictment on our election processes when things like that happen. So the lessons have been learned, but they're not being fully embraced.
Talking about fully embracing the lessons, let's link that to trust, Bishop. How critical is trust in an electoral process? I mean, obviously, the results produced obviously then lead to some sort of trust process. But because of the recurrence of violence, there seems to be a lack of trust between the citizens and the government.
Yes, there is. And you can see sometimes the lack of trust bring in voter apathy. It's one of the issues. Number two, the fact that people are, we then have a problem of social contract, which is very low in terms of how our society takes our leadership seriously.
Right.
Whoever is entrusted with power or with responsibility to govern, their first struggle is the social contract. Their next struggle is just to get the populace going,
Right.
to do what they have to do to make this economy tick because of trust issues. So it's important and it's good for the entire nation, for all of us, for the sake of the future, for the sake of the generality of the people, for anyone who gets in to govern this nation after elections, for them to move on, there is need for trust. Once the trust is not there, the social contract is at its lowest. It will take another 2-3 years for whoever is in power to get this nation going. And by so doing, we are already at a minus. So without trust, we start at a minus. We start at a negative. So to start at a positive, that's what we must begin to build. And how do we do that? By obviously inculcating in our nation the fact that our elections are going to be fair, free, and credible. That's the first plus that we build. Then once that's done, it's now left on whoever has been given the responsibility to run. They can subtract by themselves or add what we have already given them by the process in which we do our elections.
Well, after the short break, we'll continue this conversation as we talk about the highly polarized nature of our country and if this is one of the causes in leading to some sort of violence. Will we as a nation in such a polarized environment be able to look to peace as a solution? We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Election Watch program. As today we're talking about peace and elections, the link between peace and elections, and asking the key questions: can we disagree peacefully in our country as we draw closer to our 2023 elections, which are on the 23rd of August? And, just before the break, we were giving a sort of a background and foundation of, where we're coming from as a country and the sort of violence that has plagued our nation for the past 40 years. But right now, we want to talk about the polarization of our political environment and if this has any link to the violence and if a peace is the solution. Welcome back. All right, so I'll start with Jana, and let's talk a little bit about our political landscape. Obviously, it being polarized in nature. And it's interesting, we had a conversation with young people and women, and they were all going back to an issue around our country is no longer about nation building, but it's about specific individuals at the end of the day. What needs to be done to ensure that we have a peaceful election and that we move away from polarization?
I think Bishop would even be more qualified to talk about that. But I think for me, maybe I'll premise it by saying this, and then Bishop can come in. The work that the church is doing, which is quite incredible, that I feel is really seeking to address the issues of polarization. What I think is really said, probably more in the last 20 years, but in the history of our country, if you start from Kukurahundi up to where we are today, is you are finding homes. So it's not the division and the polarization is not only at the national level, but it has precipitated to literally even at homes, where, like you say, our association of who I choose to vote for is become a key component of our identity, and therefore becomes a marker of whether I can live peaceable with you or not. The level of intolerance that is there is really divided us. And I think the church, Bishop, has got a big part to play in this. So I think the question is to go to Bishop.
The issue of polarization, first of all, I think one of my greatest challenges starts from even how we do our slogans. Right. One of the biggest problems that we have is our slogans, how we do sloganeering. Sloganeering can start polarizing people. Number one. Number two, we must learn to have unity in diversity. To know that we can be united even we are different. So what needs to be done, and what the church in particular needs to do, unfortunately, sometimes I see the church also playing a part in polarization, in the sense that you have bishops who are now publicly partisan, and then they want to preach to a diverse congregation. So what I think, or the obvious thing is, we are so polarized, obviously, on party lines, sometimes on regional lines, and sometimes even on mutupo lines. You know what I'm saying? I am of this totem and I'm of that totem. It polarizes us, which makes it very difficult because it's no longer about ideas. It's about who. It's no longer about who is bringing the best on the table. Right now, our politics is not about who brings the best policies on the table. It's just about who. Whether they are good or bad, it doesn't matter, as long as it's me and my tribesmen, or it's me and my brother. So, which is what makes democracy very difficult in an African setting, so to speak, because we are too fragmented. And if democracy is by the people in the popular vote, and sometimes it's not those who have the best brains that have the biggest numbers. Or not brains, let's talk about ideologies. Let's talk about value to the table. And now you can see everybody is going for popularity more than bringing value on the table. That's what is polarized our society. What we then need to begin to do is to educate our voting population to vote based on value. If people begin to vote based on value, it doesn't matter whether it's Bishop Mparuza. What value is Bishop bringing on the table? Does it bring our Ubuntu values on the table? Does it make our people work? So it starts when somebody wants to eat what they have not worked for. It's already bringing polarization, because violence is the spirit of a thief. You know, a thief will come and violate you to eat what they did not work for. And it's basically what I think we need to begin to educate our nation. And the church must take a center stage to say, let's value life, first of all. Let's value familyhood. Let's value being Zimbabwean first before anything else, and then be each other's keeper. And then we must ask our politicians to sit on the same table publicly. My problem with our politicians, they sit and drink tea together privately and discuss some of these things, but when it comes to the public, they all take posturing, which divides the population.
Thank you so much, Bishop. Jana, beyond just political parties, as Bishop was talking about, looking at the value that's being brought on the table, what or who are the other stakeholders that have an important role in ensuring that peace prevails during this period? I know Bishop, mentioned already the church's key role, but who are the other stakeholders?
I think the other stakeholders are definitely the different officials that have been put in place, the commissions that are in place, importantly around elections.
Right.
The Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, it has the biggest role. Right now the spotlight is on it because it has the responsibility to conduct and facilitate the election process in Zimbabwe. And so how it conducts itself, it must not only do things legally or transparently, but it must also be seen to be doing, so that people really have faith. Because as Bishop said earlier on, when we lose trust in institutions, then whatever that institution is doing becomes questionable. The security forces are key to not be partisan, but to take a stand of protecting the citizenry and all the infrastructure of this nation. I think the courts, I think we saw with the process of candidates going to go and submit their papers, that there have been disputes already. So the courts play a really critical role as well. Because again, if these processes are not handled, not only according to the law, but also the spirit of the law. There's a thing called the spirit of the law, which is the idea and the concept that was behind the text that we have put here. It's important. I would also say, of course, during elections, we have observers. We mostly focus on the ones that come from outside our country, but our local observers, for me, are a critical component because they know the context of the country, they know the dynamics of the country, and they can better interpret than a person who's not Zimbabwean, who might not understand our culture and way of doing things. For me, all those actors are key, and of course, civil society, because it plays a really important role to educate the nation, just like what we are doing here today, that Civio has brought us here to have this discussion. It's part of educating, it's part of putting out messages to the nation that we must conduct ourselves peacefully and be peaceable in how we engage. But I will not leave out the political parties, because ultimately they are the ones who are putting themselves out there. How they conduct themselves, the language and the words that they use can be inflammatory if not done with consideration. That's what sparks things that happen that cause harm to our population, when they do not hold their members to account. Because sometimes that's what happens, that you hear the leaders say one rhetoric, but the members are doing something, and you are not hearing the leaders bring their members to account. For me, that's extremely critical. That political parties actually realize they're the bride and groom, if I was to use that language. They are the center of all of this, while Zeki, yes, is the facilitator. And so how they behave and how they ensure that their membership conducts itself is critical to ensuring that we have a peaceful election.
Well, after the short break, we'll continue this conversation in our last segment, as we know that the official results will obviously produce winners and losers. But the key question is, how do you manage the disappointment of those who would have lost? We'll be right back. Welcome back to our last segment of the Election Watch program, proudly brought to you by the Civio Institute. As of course, we're talking about the importance of peace and disagreeing peacefully. And to join me for this conversation, I have with me Bishop Neva Mparuta, who's the president of EFZ, and Janan Ngube, who's the deputy chief executive officer of Crisis Action. And just before the break, we were talking about some of the challenges within our systems. For example, having such a polarized political environment in Zimbabwe and how we can overcome that. The role of the church as well. And of course, we were looking at some of the solutions and key stakeholders who can play a key role in helping us have a peaceful 2023 election. And of course, just before the break, we asked a very important question. We know that during the 2023 election, we're going to have winners and losers. But how do you manage the disappointment of those who would have lost in the election? And I'll start with Bishop. Let's talk a little bit about the peace pledge and why it plays such an important role as we draw closer to the elections.
Thank you very much. The peace pledge becomes one of the key components towards a peaceful environment of our election processes. During the peace pledge, we had made most of the key political players in terms of political parties, at least about 7 of them, 11 had pledged to come, but I think eventually we had about 7 or 9 of them who came to sign to the peace pledge, which is a very critical step towards a peaceful environment in terms of, first of all, the signing, the act of the signing. Secondly, we are looking forward adherence to the peace pledge content itself within the pledge, as well as adhering to that in terms of what we agreed there after elections. So it's very important that we did that. What we need is to popularize that pledge. What we need is to continue talking about it. I'm so grateful that the political parties themselves agreed to come and do that, which is very important. For me, that willingness to say we want a peaceful environment, we want a peaceful process during, before, during, and after election, it became very, very good and apparent that there is a willingness. What we are now wanting is to be practitioners of what we signed to.
Okay. So maybe, Bishop, you can tell us some of the components of the peace pledge. Why do you think, or do you believe that the political parties are actually going to live up to this pledge?
They must. They must live to the pledge, because what the pledge, what we have in the pledge, what it will do is it will make our elections credible. It will help, number one, in all what we are trying to do as a nation. Yeah. If our elections are credible, it means we are credible as a society. All the things that we are trying to do economically, politically, in the family of nations is taken to be, the results are legitimate because of how we would have done it. If we don't, no matter how we can speak out there, once there is a perception, sometimes perception is reality to some people. So my take is the first step that they did is a step towards the credibility of our elections. The action thereafter and what happens soon after elections is good for us as a nation in the way we are viewed from the community of nations, because we don't live in an isolation. if we need to take our economy forward, if we need to take our nation forward, that credibility is very, very important. So for me, it's the credibility of the outcome which is at stake here, so that we are able to move forward as a united force. You don't want after election somebody is now going to the courts, somebody is now going to demonstrate. Yeah. It's not good for us as a nation. So that's what we're trying to say, to agree as a nation, in particular with the political players themselves, to say, why don't you do it decently? Yeah. As civilized citizens and as civilized politicians and political parties. So we hope and trust that our political leaders will cascade down this down to the grassroots, so that there is no need. And sometimes I'm hoping as a bishop that what we speak, we act. Because we have had at the top the call for non-violent election, the call for a peaceful election. All the key players have done that. Yeah. But my worry is I'm not yet seeing it on the ground. There's still a gap between the reality at the top and the reality on the ground. That's what we as a church needs to come in and begin to help, persuade, and push towards a reality on the ground of a peaceful, credible election result. That's what we really would want.
Thank you so much, Bishop Mparta. Jana, it's interesting that the bishop, ended with some very important key points where he was talking about the reality at the top not matching what's really happening on the ground. And as we said, that obviously the reality is when an election happens, we have winners and losers. How do we help sort of manage the situation as, of course, after the election, the results have been announced? Why is it important that there's dialogue or mediation to help sort of manage the process?
Yeah. Well, I would first like to say on that one, I'm really proud of this country, that regardless all the challenges we experience, we've not given up on our democracy. And I am proud of Zimbabweans, because participating in an election is an expression of your desire to see your country be something with which you envisage and you want to see continue to happen. And as you say, the participation in an election will bring out people who have different views, as we have talked, and there will be results that come out. We need to continue to uphold those values of care for our country's democracy in how we conduct ourselves post an election. I would say to the political parties, for me, is the fact that they are participating in the electoral process. It means they are putting trust that this process can produce something for them. They must do everything they can to safeguard the votes that they believe will come their way as part of the process. However, they also must be willing to accept the results that come out. To talk about how the system is broken after, when you went in knowing that the system is broken, it creates, I think part of the stuff that then disturbs how the larger population, because as Bishop well put out, that what is said here can really have an influence in how people on the ground receive it. So, well, yes, we walk into the election with a hope. I think we also must have the courage to embrace outcomes, even if they are not the outcomes that we want. Where we have disputes in our electoral law, we have the courts, there are mechanisms and systems that are put in place in there for us to go in and address our queries that are going on. I think we've seen it with candidates processes, that some actually who had been disqualified are now have been qualified and so forth. And so then there are all things that are still ongoing. And I think that must continuously be supported and be encouraged. But should then things, whatever result comes out, I think there must be a coming to peace for the individual leaders themselves and their political parties, with whatever result that has come out of the process. We honestly do not want, for me, we definitely don't want post-election violence like what we saw in our last election, that people actually were able to vote and whatnot, but then in the aftermath, that's when mayhem happened. Right now in Kenya, you are dealing with a country that elections happened, court processes were engaged, the courts made a ruling, but the opposition is still now causing different drama that is having a significant impact on the economy. So that affects the well-being of the same population that you seek to. When it comes to that, I'll go back to Kenya again, because not maybe with Ruto and Odinga in this instance, but we saw in the last election what is called the handshake. If you say the handshake in Kenya, it means something, where eventually pastors actually brought the political leaders together after the election and at a prayer breakfast. And these two ended up shaking hands and agreeing to find a way of working together for the betterment of the country. Because what we want is for Zimbabwe to develop and for Zimbabweans to be able to live a dignified life. And that's what, for me, all political participants, leaders, voters ought to be pursuing. So we need the humility for the winner, the humility for the courage maybe for the loser to agree to, like what they have done, Bishop, when you brought them around a table. Because I was really proud of the church on Friday when they brought the political parties around the table to sign the peace pledge. Hopefully after the elections, you can also bring them around the table again to have a different type of dialogue about how they play their different roles. Because not being the governing party does not mean you don't have a role in the development of the country. And that we help each other find that. So yes, an ability to come around the table and talk is important. When we feel we are not able to do it by ourselves, we have the church, we have elders in this nation who can help that conversation. If we really feel by ourselves we are failing as Zimbabweans, we have neighbors and friends who can come and help. But I think we've got it.
I wanted to add something to that. For us to come to a place where we are saying the after elections environment is created by the before elections and during elections environment. And that's why we're trying to say, let's have a peace pledge, let's campaign as Zimbabweans. It's not like you have Zimbabweans and non-Zimbabweans campaigning to be voted in Zimbabwe. So the now environment is very critical to the environment that is after the elections, because the now environment begets the environment after election. So I think let's do that and let's continue the peaceful environment that we have. It's not, you can't really make it look like it's really hell on earth. At least we have a relatively very peaceful environment with those sporadic incidences that we outrightly condemn. We don't want people to die. We don't want people to lose their properties. But we also want, in order for us to have a peaceful after elections, we must do it properly now. Set a good environment. Let winners win fairly. You understand what I'm saying? And let losers lose fairly. Once we do that and we then see you lost fairly and you want to cause us problems, we just tell you what's wrong with you. And it must be clear that, and there are those who may just want mayhem for the sake of mayhem because they've lost. Like Jana is saying, we don't want a Zimbabwe like that to say, if it's not me. In the Bible, we have the incident of the woman who said, who slept on her baby. Now, when it was time she said, the king said, can we cut? And the other one said, yes, cut. And you will know, we will see after election who wants Zimbabwe cut. Because they don't really care for the nation. We don't want people to say, cut the baby. What we want is, let the baby live. Zimbabwe is the baby here. Zimbabwe must have life after elections. We want this nation to develop. Zimbabwe is one of the richest nations in the family of nations. And we must safeguard that. We must safeguard who we are as Zimbabweans. I think that's very important. So how we do our disputes, we need to re-choreograph how we do our disputes. It's very important. We grew up with all manner of examples of how disputes are done.
Yeah.
Culturally, we have how to do disputes. We say there are so many ways of dealing with our disputes. We have uncles, aunties, and like Jana was saying, if we can't handle it, we invite our neighbors to come and help us. But I really think within ourselves, we have enough systems, we have enough organs and organizations that can help us. That's why, number one, the church is there to do that. But the church itself must also be credible. Sometimes we have a church that is partisan. And when a church is partisan, which political party can trust us to say you are going to be a fair broker for what we are trying to do? But besides church, we have our legal instruments, our legal organs in the nation. All the systems that are there of the nations must do what must be done to keep this nation moving forward.
Well, thank you so much, Bishop. That was Bishop Neva Parutsa, who's the president of the Evangelical Fellowship of Zimbabwe and presiding bishop of the Pentecostal Assemblies of Zimbabwe. And I also had with me Jana Ncube, who's the deputy chief executive officer at Crisis Action. Today we were discussing about the importance of peace and disagreeing peacefully. And Jana's last words were, at the end of the day, it doesn't mean if a political party has lost, you can't be part of the democratic process. And of course, Bishop also adds on to say that pre and post elections, right now before we get into elections, it sort of sets the tone of what it will look like after the elections. Thank you to everyone who joined us for this conversation. And until next time, we'll see you all.